The basement always felt like a place outside of time. Down there, with the low ceiling and the single window that barely let in the gray January light, it was easy to forget that the world above us was moving forward. The old television flickered with some game neither of us had touched in an hour. The controllers sat abandoned on the coffee table, tangled in their cords like everything else in my life that winter. I held the beer bottle against my palm, feeling the condensation seep through my skin. It had gone warm 20 minutes ago, but I kept holding it anyway. Across from me, Caleb had stretched himself across the plaid couch that my mother had banished to the basement years earlier. His legs were too long for the space, his feet hanging over the armrest in that careless way he inhabited every room he entered. We had been talking about nothing. Work, the weather, the way the city looked buried under 3 feet of snow. But underneath our words, something else was happening. Something I had been trying not to name for weeks. Caleb reached for something on the armrest beside him, and I realized it was my chapstick. The cheap kind from the drugstore, the one I had pulled from my pocket earlier and left there without thinking. He held it up between us like evidence of some small crime. "You have the worst chapstick," he said, and there was something playful in his voice that made my chest tighten. He was grinning in that lazy way he had, the one that had gotten him out of trouble since we were 17. "It smells like a high school hallway." I shrugged because I did not trust my voice. "It works," I told him. What happened next felt like it lasted both forever and no time at all. Caleb uncapped the tube, his eyes still fixed on mine, and slowly drew it across his bottom lip. Then his top. His mouth was slightly parted when he finished, and I could see the faint shine the bomb had left behind. "Want it back?" he said. It was not quite a question. The air in the basement had been warm before, but now it felt thick, charged with something I could not breathe around. Caleb leaned forward, closing the distance between the couch and my chair by just a few inches, but it felt like he had crossed an ocean. I could smell his cologne mixed with something else, something that belonged only to him. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought he might actually do it. I thought he might bridge that final space between us and press his mouth to mine, chapstick and all. The thought terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. Then Caleb laughed, a sound that should have been casual, dismissive, normal. He tossed the chapstick back to me, and it landed in my lap with a soft thud. "Relax, dude," he said. "I am just messing with you." But even as he said it, even as he leaned back into the couch and took a long drink from his own beer, his eyes never left mine. There was something in his gaze that contradicted his words entirely, something serious and searching and real. I picked up the chapstick from my lap and held it in my palm. It was still warm from his touch. My hands were shaking, just slightly, and I hoped he could not see it in the dim light of the basement. I tried to laugh along with him, tried to play the part of the friend who found the joke funny. But the sound that came from my throat was weak and hollow, because whatever had just happened between us was not a joke, and we both knew it. The game on the television continued its endless loop of background noise. Outside, the snow kept falling, and in that basement, suspended between what we were and what we might become, neither of us said another word. The morning after the chapstick incident, I woke to the sound of Juniper pawing at my bedroom door. She always knew when I had slept poorly, and that night had been a collection of restless hours punctuated by the memory of Caleb's mouth and the weight of that small tube in my palm. I made coffee in the same chipped mug I had been using for 3 years, the one with the faded library logo that reminded me daily of the predictable rhythm my life had fallen into. At 34, I had carved out an existence that was deliberately small, deliberately quiet. I worked in the circulation department of the regional library system, a job that suited my preference for order and solitude. Books came back, books went out. People spoke in whispers. The world moved at a manageable pace. My duplex in Albany was the kind of place you settled into rather than chose with passion. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen just large enough for one person to move around comfortably. Juniper claimed the sunny spot by the living room window, and I had arranged my life around her schedule and mine. Records played on an old turntable I had inherited from my father. Books filled every surface, most of them bought secondhand from the shop down the street. It was a life lived in soft tones, muted colors, careful distances. Once a month, I taught poetry workshops at the community center. Usually 8 or 10 people showed up, mostly older women who had always wanted to write and finally had the time. I enjoyed these evenings more than I expected to. There was something about helping people find words for feelings they had carried silently for years that felt like a small form of grace. My romantic life had been a series of brief encounters that never quite took root. There was Marcus, the graduate student who stayed for 6 months before deciding he needed more excitement than I could provide. Before him, there was David, who lasted 3 weeks before admitting he was still in love with his ex-boyfriend. And scattered throughout my 20s, a handful of others whose names I sometimes had to think hard to remember. Under my bed, there were boxes of letters I had written but never sent. Letters to men I had dated, letters to friends I had lost touch with, letters to versions of myself I was still trying to understand. Writing them felt necessary. Sending them felt impossible. Caleb had not been part of this careful, contained world for over a decade. We had been close in high school, the kind of friendship that felt essential and permanent in the way that only teenage bonds can. But college pulled us in different directions, and adulthood scattered us further. He had gotten married young, moved to Boston, started a family. I had heard updates through mutual friends over the years, but they felt like stories about a stranger who happened to share a name with someone I used to know. Then, 18 months ago, he moved back to Albany, divorced, with a 6-year-old daughter named Ivy who lived with him every other week. He reached out through social media, suggested we get coffee, see how the years had treated us. I almost declined. The past felt safer left alone. But I said yes, and within an hour of sitting across from him at the downtown cafe, it was as if no time had passed at all. He still had the same easy laugh, the same way of leaning forward when he was interested in what you were saying. He still drummed his fingers on tables when he was thinking, and still ate the foam off his cappuccino with a spoon like he had when we were 17. What was different was the way he looked at me. In high school, his attention had been scattered across a dozen interests, a dozen friends, a dozen possibilities. Now, when he focused on me, it felt concentrated, intentional, like I was the only person in the room worth noticing. The friendship that rekindled between us felt both familiar and strange. He would text me at random hours with memories that had surfaced while he was driving or grocery shopping. Remember when we skipped third period to sit in your car and listen to that Radiohead album? Remember the night we drove to the lake just to see if the stars looked different from there? I remembered everything. I had never stopped remembering. Caleb began stopping by my duplex on evenings when his daughter was with her mother. At first, it was purposeful visits. He needed help moving furniture, or wanted to borrow a book, or was in the neighborhood and thought he would say hello. But gradually, the pretenses fell away, and he would simply appear at my door with no reason beyond wanting company. He was good with Juniper, who usually hid from visitors but seemed to accept him as part of the furniture within a few weeks. He would sprawl on my couch with her curled against his leg, telling me stories about his job at the insurance company or his daughter's latest obsession with drawing elaborate maps of imaginary places. I began to look forward to these visits in a way that worried me. I would find myself cleaning the apartment on days when I thought he might come by, or stopping at the store to buy the kind of beer he preferred. When Thursday evenings arrived and he had not appeared by 8 o'clock, I felt something that was uncomfortably close to disappointment. It was during one of these casual visits that I began to notice the small changes in how he moved through my space. He would linger in doorways, watching me make coffee or sort through mail. His hand would brush mine when he reached for something, and the contact would last just a fraction longer than necessary. When he laughed at something I said, he would lean closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. The night with the chapstick had not been an isolated incident. It was the culmination of weeks of small moments that had been building towards something I did not have words for. And as winter deepened around us, as the snow piled higher against my windows and the evenings grew longer and darker, I began to realize that whatever was happening between us was no longer something I could ignore or explain away. Caleb was changing the shape of my carefully ordered life, and I was letting him. More than that, I was welcoming it. For the first time in years, my small, quiet world felt too small to hold everything I was beginning to feel. The invitation came on a Thursday night in February, after we had worked our way through most of a six-pack and the conversation had turned soft and meandering. Caleb was stretched across my couch again, juniper curled against his thigh, and I was in the armchair with my feet tucked under me. The snow outside had been falling for hours, thick and silent, turning the world beyond my windows into something muffled and distant. We had been talking about high school, the way we often did during these late-night visits. Not the big moments, but the small ones that had somehow lodged themselves in our memories. The time we had driven 40 minutes to a record store in Troy just to buy an album we could have ordered online. The night we had sat in his car in the parking lot behind the movie theater, talking until the sun came up because neither of us wanted to go home. "My friend has this cabin up near Lakewood," Caleb said suddenly, interrupting a comfortable silence. His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it that made me look up from my beer. "He owns it, but hardly ever uses it. Says I can borrow it whenever I want." I waited for him to continue, sensing there was more. "I was thinking maybe we could go up there for a weekend. Just us. Like the old days." His eyes met mine across the dim living room. "It would be good to get out of the city for a while." The old days. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with everything we had been and everything we were becoming. I felt my chest tighten the way it had in the basement that night with the chapstick. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, and part of me wanted to make excuses to retreat back into the safety of my predictable routines. A weekend alone with Caleb, in an isolated cabin, with nothing but time and whatever was building between us. It felt dangerous in a way that both terrified and thrilled me. I hesitated longer than I should have, and Caleb noticed. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more uncertain. "If you would rather not," he said quietly, "I understand." But I was already shaking my head. "No," I told him. "I would like that. I would like that a lot." The smile that spread across his face was worth every moment of anxiety that followed. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined and nothing like I had prepared for. Small and weathered, tucked into a grove of pine trees that looked like something from a Christmas card. The driveway had not been plowed in weeks, and we had to park at the bottom of the hill and carry our bags through knee-deep snow. By the time we reached the front door, we were both breathless and laughing, our faces stung red by the cold. Inside, the air smelled like wood smoke and dust, and the faint mustiness of a place that spent most of its time empty. The main room was all rough-hewn beams and stone fireplace, with mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected over decades. There were two small bedrooms off a narrow hallway, and a kitchen that was barely large enough for one person to move around in. It was perfect in its imperfection, isolated in a way that made the rest of the world feel very far away. Caleb got the fire going while I unpacked groceries and tried not to think too hard about what we were doing here. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, steady and hypnotic, sealing us into our own private world. We cooked dinner together, moving around each other in the tiny kitchen with an ease that surprised me. Caleb opened a bottle of whiskey he had brought, and we drank it slowly as the evening settled around us. The conversation flowed the way it always did between us, but there was something different about it here. More intimate, more honest. We talked about our parents, comparing the ways they had shaped us and the ways we had tried to escape their influence. Caleb told me about his father's expectations, the pressure to be successful and conventional and unquestioningly masculine. I shared stories about my mother's quiet disappointment in the life I had chosen, her gentle but persistent questions about when I might settle down with someone nice. "Do you remember what you wanted to be when you were 18? Caleb asked as we moved to the couch in front of the fireplace. The whiskey had made him thoughtful, more serious than usual. I thought about it for a moment. "A writer," I said. "I wanted to publish poetry collections and live in a cabin just like this one and never have to worry about anything practical." "And now you work in a library and live in a duplex and worry about everything practical," he said, but not unkindly. "What about you?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I wanted to travel. I wanted to see places that did not look like anywhere I had ever been. I wanted to fall in love with someone who understood me completely and loved them back the same way. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. I got married instead, he continued. Had a kid. Bought a house in the suburbs and a car with good safety ratings, and learned to be the kind of man I thought I was supposed to be. There was something raw in his voice that made me look at him more closely. In the firelight, his face looked younger and older at the same time. What happened? I asked. With your marriage? He took a long drink of whiskey before answering. I did not cheat, he said finally, but I lied in other ways. I waited for him to elaborate, but he did not. There were some truths that could only be approached slowly, and I sensed this was one of them. The evening wound down gradually, the way good evenings do. We finished the whiskey and let the fire burn low and talked about smaller things until the yawns began to outnumber the words. The bedrooms were cold, the kind of bone-deep cold that old houses hold on to even when the heat is running. I settled into the narrow bed in the room that faced the woods, listening to Caleb moving around in the room next to mine. The walls were thin enough that I could hear him brushing his teeth, the creak of floorboards as he got ready for sleep. Then, sometime in the deep hours of the night, I heard my door open. The heater in my room stopped working, Caleb said quietly from the doorway. His voice was barely above a whisper. I can hear it clicking, but no heat is coming out. I could see his silhouette against the dim light from the hallway, and my heart began to beat faster. You can sleep in here, I told him, shifting over to make room. The bed was small, barely large enough for two people, but I did not suggest he try to fix the heater or move to the couch. He climbed in beside me without hesitation, settling under the covers like it was the most natural thing in the world. We arranged ourselves carefully, back to back, maintaining a thin strip of space between us that felt both protective and fragile. But I could feel the heat of his body through his t-shirt. I could hear his breathing, deep and measured, and I knew from the rhythm that he was not asleep any more than I was. The cabin creaked around us. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in those dark hours before dawn, lying close enough to feel each other's heartbeat, everything between us changed again. We drove back to Albany in a silence that felt different from any quiet we had shared before. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world clean and bright and almost painfully beautiful. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, and I found myself watching the way the morning light caught the stubble along his jaw. Something had shifted during those hours we spent lying back to back in that narrow bed. Not anything we could name or discuss, but something fundamental in the space between us. The careful distance we had maintained for months felt suddenly artificial, like a game we had been playing without realizing it. Back in my duplex, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of my ordinary life, I kept thinking about the weight of his body next to mine in the dark. The way his breathing had changed when he thought I was asleep. The way mine had changed when I thought he was. The first sign that things were different came 3 days later, when Caleb appeared at my door with no excuse at all. Usually, he came with a purpose, however thin. He needed to return something he had borrowed, or wanted my opinion on a gift for his daughter, or was in the neighborhood running errands. This time, he simply stood in my doorway and said he had been thinking about me. I let him in, of course. I made coffee, and we sat in my living room talking about work and the weather and the book I was reading. But underneath the ordinary conversation, there was something electric, something charged with possibility. When he left that night, he hugged me goodbye. Not the casual, backslapping embrace we had shared for months, but something slower, more deliberate. His arm stayed around me for several heartbeats longer than necessary, and when he pulled away, his hand lingered on my shoulder. After that, he began stopping by more often, not just on the evenings when his daughter was with her mother, but whenever the mood struck him. He would text me from work saying he was thinking about picking up Thai food. Did I want some? Or he would call on Sunday mornings to see if I wanted company while I did laundry. These visits had a different quality than they had before the cabin. More relaxed, more intimate. He moved through my space like someone who belonged there, making himself coffee without asking, settling onto my couch with Juniper like he had been doing it for years instead of months. The physical space between us grew smaller in increments, so gradual I almost did not notice at first. When we sat on the couch watching movies, he would lean closer during the funny parts, his shoulder bumping mine. When we cooked dinner together, he would reach around me to get something from a cabinet, his chest brushing against my back. One evening in March, as I was reading at the kitchen table, he walked up behind my chair and casually brushed something from my beard. A crumb from dinner, maybe, or just an excuse to touch me. But his fingers lingered against my cheek for a moment after the crumb was gone, and when I looked up at him, his expression was soft and serious. "You had something," he said quietly, but he did not move his hand away. I could not speak, could barely breathe. The moment stretched between us like a held note, full of everything we were not saying. Then Juniper jumped onto the table, scattering my papers, and the spell broke. Caleb laughed and stepped back, and I pretended to be annoyed with the cat instead of grateful for the interruption. But I thought about that touch for days afterward. The warmth of his fingers against my skin. The way he had looked at me like he was seeing something new. Another night, I came down with a cold that left me weak and congested and generally miserable. I had texted him to cancel our plans to watch a basketball game, expecting him to make other arrangements. Instead, he showed up at my door 2 hours later with a bag of groceries and a determined expression. "You should not be here," I told him, my voice hoarse and scratchy. "You will get sick." He pushed past me into the apartment. "I brought soup," he said. "The good kind, from that place you like downtown." He made me sit on the couch while he heated the soup and made tea with honey. He found the bottle of cold medicine in my bathroom cabinet and measured out the proper dose like he was taking care of a child. When I protested that he was being ridiculous, he told me to shut up and eat my soup. I fell asleep on the couch sometime after dinner, lulled by the medicine and the rare luxury of being taken care of. When I woke up hours later, Caleb was still there, dozing in the armchair with a book open in his lap. The sight of him sleeping in my living room, completely at ease, made something warm and complicated unfurl in my chest. I watched him for a long time in the dim light from the kitchen, studying the way his hair fell across his forehead, the way his face looked younger and more vulnerable in sleep. This was dangerous territory, I knew. This level of caring, this depth of wanting. But I could not seem to help myself. During these weeks, I began writing again. Not the careful, academic poetry I had been producing for my workshops, but something rawer and more honest. I wrote about hands that lingered too long in casual touches, about the weight of another person sleeping in the next room, about winter shadows and the way firelight could make ordinary moments feel sacred. I wrote about the space between wanting and having, about the terrible sweetness of almost but not quite. I filled page after page with images I could not share with anyone, especially not with Caleb himself. The poems stayed hidden in a notebook I kept in my bedroom drawer, next to the boxes of unsent letters. Another collection of words I did not have the courage to speak aloud. Then came the night in late March when everything changed again. We were in my basement, playing video games and drinking beer, when Caleb found my chapstick on the armrest of the old couch. The same tube, the same brand that smelled like a high school hallway. He held it up with that familiar lazy grin and made the same joke about my terrible taste in lip balm. But this time, when he uncapped it and drew it slowly across his mouth, when he leaned forward and asked if I wanted it back, I did not let the moment pass. I reached for him instead of the chapstick. My fingers found the collar of his shirt, and I pulled him closer until there was no space left between us at all. The kiss was everything I had been imagining and nothing like I had expected. Soft and desperate and tasting faintly of beer and that ridiculous chapstick. His hands came up to frame my face, and I could feel him smiling against my mouth. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Caleb rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his hands still cupping my face. "I have been wanting to do that for months," he whispered. "I have been wanting you to," I whispered back. And in that basement, surrounded by the accumulated debris of our shared history, everything between us finally caught fire. After the kiss, we did not talk about what it meant. We simply let it exist between us, this new reality that changed the texture of every moment we shared. Caleb stayed later that night, and we watched a movie with careful space between us on the couch, but the air felt different now, charged with possibility and weighted with questions neither of us was ready to ask. He came by the next evening, and the next. We fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and precarious, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. We cooked dinner together, talked about our days, settled into the familiar comfort of each other's company. But underneath it all was the memory of that kiss, the knowledge that we had crossed a line we could not uncross. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon in early April. Caleb called me at work, which he rarely did, and I could hear traffic in the background. "I have to run an errand," he said without preamble. "Pick up some paperwork from my lawyer. It is going to take a couple hours, and Ivy is with me today. I was wondering if you might be able to watch her for a while." I had heard him talk about his daughter countless times over the months, had seen pictures on his phone, but I had never actually met her. The prospect made me nervous in a way I could not quite name. "Of course," I told him. "Bring her over." They arrived an hour later, Caleb carrying a small backpack and holding the hand of a girl who looked exactly like him in miniature. Dark hair, serious brown eyes, the same way of taking in a room like she was cataloging everything she saw. She was smaller than I had expected, more delicate, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was older than her 6 years in ways that mattered. "Ivy," Caleb said, kneeling down to her level. "This is my friend Elliot, the one I have told you about." She studied me solemnly for a moment, then nodded. "You have a cat," she said. It was not a question. "I do," I told her. "Her name is Juniper. Would you like to meet her?" As if summoned, Juniper appeared from the kitchen, padding over to investigate our visitors. To my surprise, she did not retreat to her usual hiding spot under the couch. Instead, she allowed Ivy to pet her, even purring when small fingers scratched behind her ears. "She likes you," I said, genuinely surprised. "Animals always like me," Ivy replied matter-of-factly. "My mom says I have a gentle spirit." Caleb caught my eye over his daughter's head, and something passed between us. Pride, maybe, or the complex tenderness that comes with loving someone who is trying to navigate the aftermath of divorce while raising a child. "I will be back in a couple hours," he said, kissing the top of Ivy's head. "Be good for Elliot, okay?" She nodded seriously, already absorbed in watching Juniper's tail twitch back and forth across the hardwood floor. After Caleb left, I found myself unsure how to entertain a 6-year-old. My apartment was not equipped for children. There were no toys, no games designed for small hands, nothing that might hold the interest of someone whose world was so different from mine. But Ivy seemed content to explore. She wandered through my living room, examining my books and records with the same careful attention she had given me when we first met. She asked thoughtful questions about things that caught her interest. Why did I have so many books? Did I really read all of them? What was my favorite song? When she discovered my turntable, I put on an old jazz album, something mellow and instrumental. She listened with her head tilted, like she was trying to decode a language she did not quite understand. "It sounds like being underwater," she said finally. I had never thought of it that way, but she was right. "Are you hungry?" I asked when it became clear that she was settling in for the duration. She nodded, and I found myself making grilled cheese sandwiches while she sat at my kitchen table, swinging her legs and chattering about school and her friends and the elaborate fort she was building in her bedroom at her mother's house. She was easy to be around in a way that surprised me. There was no need to fill every silence or manufacture entertainment. She seemed perfectly content to exist in the same space, asking occasional questions, but mostly just observing. After lunch, she asked if she could draw. I found some paper and a handful of colored pencils I had forgotten I owned, and she settled back at the kitchen table while I washed dishes and tried not to watch her too obviously. She worked with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she focused on getting the details right. I could see her glancing up at me occasionally, then back down at her paper, like she was checking something against reality. When I finished cleaning up, she was putting the final touches on her creation. 2 stick figures holding hands under a sky full of blue and white snowflakes. One figure was taller, with brown scribbles for hair. The other was shorter, with black marks that might have been a beard. That is very nice, I said, leaning over to get a better look. My voice came out more carefully neutral than I had intended. She held it up proudly, examining her work with a critical eye. This is you and Daddy, she said plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Because you make him smile. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my hands start to shake slightly, and I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself. He talks about you a lot, she continued, oblivious to the way her simple observation had just rearranged something fundamental in my chest. When he picks me up from Mom's house, he always wants to know if I think we should stop by and see you. I could not speak, could not process what this 6-year-old child was telling me so matter-of-factly. That whatever was happening between Caleb and me was visible even to her. That she had been watching and listening and drawing her own conclusions about the shape of our relationship. Can I keep this? I managed to ask. She nodded and carefully folded the paper in half, then in half again, making precise creases with her small fingers. When she handed it to me, I held it like it might dissolve in my hands. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Ivy curled up on my couch with Juniper and looked through one of my books, pointing out words she recognized. I sat nearby, ostensibly reading, but really just watching this small person who had somehow managed to see straight through to the heart of something I had been afraid to name. When Caleb returned, he found us in the living room. Ivy was showing me a complicated hand-clapping game she had learned at school, and I was failing spectacularly at keeping up with the rhythm. The sound of our laughter must have been audible from the hallway, because he was smiling before he even entered the room. How did it go? He asked, but his eyes were on me, not his daughter. She was perfect, I told him honestly. Absolutely perfect. That night, after Caleb had taken Ivy home and returned to my apartment for what had become our usual evening routine, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. The folded drawing was in my pocket, and I kept touching it through the fabric of my jeans, reassuring myself that it was real. We were sitting on my couch, pretending to watch television, when Caleb noticed the paper on my coffee table. I had taken it out of my pocket without thinking, smoothing the creases carefully. What is that? He asked. I hesitated for only a moment before handing it to him. He unfolded it slowly, his expression growing more serious as he took in the 2 stick figures and the snowflake sky. When he looked up at me, there was something vulnerable and frightened in his eyes. She is not wrong, you know, he said quietly. The silence that followed felt enormous. I could hear my heartbeat, could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, could hear the sound of my own careful breathing. I do not know what I am doing, Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I do not know how to name what this is, or what it means, or where it leads. But I know I do not want to stop being around you. It was not a love confession. Not exactly. But I heard everything underneath his words. The confusion and the wanting and the fear of disrupting the life he had built for himself and his daughter. I was terrified, not of what he was saying, but of how much I wanted to say the same thing back to him. Of how much I wanted to reach across the space between us and tell him that I did not care about names or definitions or where any of this led. Instead, I just nodded. Because sometimes the most honest response is the simplest one. He reached for my hand then, threading our fingers together like the stick figures in his daughter's drawing. And we sat there in my living room, holding hands in the lamplight, while the weight of everything we were not saying settled around us like snow. The silence began the day after Ivy's drawing. I woke up expecting a text from Caleb, some casual message about his day, or a question about weekend plans. Instead, there was nothing. The absence felt deliberate, weighted with everything we had acknowledged the night before without actually saying. I told myself he needed time to process. That holding hands and admitting he did not want to stop being around me had probably felt like more vulnerability than he was prepared for. That he was figuring out how to reconcile the life he had built for himself with whatever this thing between us was becoming. But as one day stretched into 2, then 3, the silence began to feel less like processing and more like retreat. By Thursday, I found myself checking my phone compulsively, crafting and deleting text messages I did not have the courage to send. How was his day? Did he want to grab dinner? Was everything okay? Each unsent message felt like a small failure of nerve. The weekend arrived without any word from him. No casual visit, no appearance at my door with takeout and easy conversation. Just the echo of my own footsteps in the apartment and Juniper following me from room to room like she could sense my restlessness. I tried to write, pulling out the notebook where I had been collecting poems about hands and winter shadows and the space between wanting and having. But the words felt hollow now, disconnected from the reality of sitting alone in my living room, wondering if I had imagined the weight of his fingers threaded through mine. On Sunday, I did something I had not done in months. I opened one of the dating apps that had been gathering digital dust on my phone and started scrolling through profiles of men who looked nothing like Caleb and everything like the kind of person I should probably be interested in instead. I matched with someone named Marcus who worked in marketing and had kind eyes and a smile that looked genuine in his photos. We exchanged messages for a few days, casual and polite, and eventually made plans to meet for coffee on Thursday evening. The date was perfectly fine in every way that mattered and completely wrong in every way that counted. Marcus was intelligent and funny and clearly interested in seeing me again. He told engaging stories about his work and asked thoughtful questions about mine. When he suggested we get dinner sometime soon, I found myself agreeing even though every word felt like it was coming from someone else's mouth. Walking home afterward, I felt the familiar hollowness that had characterized most of my romantic encounters over the years. The sense that I was going through the motions of connection without actually connecting to anything real. What made it worse was that I now knew what the alternative felt like. I had experienced the electricity of genuine attraction, the way conversation could flow without effort when you were with someone who understood the shape of your thoughts. I had felt what it was like to have someone look at you like you were the only person in the room worth seeing, and I had let it slip away without a fight. The second week of silence was harder than the first. I found myself walking different routes to work, avoiding the coffee shop where Caleb and I had first reconnected and the street that led past his apartment building. I rearranged my living room, putting the armchair where the couch had been and moving the couch to face the window instead of the television. Anything to disrupt the geography of memories. I threw away Ivy's drawing 3 different times and retrieved it from the trash each time before actually taking the garbage out. The paper was getting soft and worn from being folded and unfolded, but I could not seem to let it go. On Friday night, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to work on lesson plans for my next poetry workshop, when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, familiar, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock that did not come. Instead, I heard the soft scrape of someone sitting down on the wooden steps. The creak of the old boards under shifting weight. Then nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat and the low hum of the refrigerator. I waited 10 minutes before I finally opened the door. Caleb was sitting on my front steps with his back against the railing, looking up at the stars through the bare branches of the maple tree in my front yard. He did not seem surprised to see me, just looked up with an expression I could not read. "I miss this," he said without preamble. "I miss you." The words hit me like a physical blow. All the careful emotional distance I had been trying to construct over the past 2 weeks crumbled in an instant. I sat down beside him on the steps, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool April air. "I have been thinking," he said, staring out at the empty street, "about what I am, about what this means." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. "I do not know if I am gay," he continued, "or bi, or anything with a name that makes sense to other people. I have been married. I have loved women. But I also know that when I am with you, I feel more like myself than I have in years." His voice was quiet, careful, like he was handling something fragile. "I keep thinking about that night at the cabin," he said, "the way it felt to sleep next to you. Not just the physical closeness, but the sense that I was exactly where I belonged. I have never felt that with anyone else." The admission hung in the air between us, vulnerable and honest and terrifying in its implications. "That is how I have always felt," I told him quietly. "With you." He turned to look at me then, and in the yellow glow of the streetlight, his face looked younger and older at the same time, like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. I was scared, he said. After that night with Ivy's drawing, after we held hands on your couch, I was scared of what it meant for her, for the life I have built for us. I was scared of not knowing how to be what you might need. He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from high school. But being away from you these past 2 weeks has been worse than being scared, he said. I would rather figure it out together than try to forget this thing between us exists. The space between us felt charged with possibility and weighted with everything we were finally saying out loud. I could see him struggling with something, his eyes moving from my face to my mouth and back again. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me. The way he leaned forward slightly, the way his breathing changed. But instead, he reached up and cupped my face in his hands, pressing his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. It was more intimate than a kiss would have been, somehow, more honest about what we were offering each other. I do not know what happens next, he whispered against my skin. Neither do I whispered back. But we were both there, on my front steps under the April stars, finally admitting that we wanted to find out together. And for the first time in 2 weeks, the silence between us felt like a beginning instead of an ending. Spring came slowly to Albany that year, melting the accumulated weight of winter in careful increments. The snow retreated from my front yard in patches, revealing grass that looked surprised to see sunlight again. I opened my windows for the first time in months, letting the soft April air move through rooms that had been sealed against the cold since November. The change in season felt like permission to hope for something new. After that night on my front steps, Caleb and I did not rush toward definitions or declarations. Instead, we let ourselves exist in the space between what we had been and what we might become. He started coming by again, but the visits felt different now, more honest, less careful about the distance we maintained or the length of time his hand might rest on my shoulder. We did not talk about what we were to each other. We simply were. One morning in early May, I walked into my bathroom to brush my teeth and found something that made me stop short. There, next to my toothbrush and the small bottle of cologne I used on special occasions, was a tube of chapstick. Not mine. A different brand. The kind that came in a black tube and smelled faintly of mint instead of the artificial cherry that had become such a complicated symbol between us. Caleb had stayed over the night before, falling asleep on my couch after we had watched a late movie and talked until our words began to slur with exhaustion. But at some point during the night or early morning, he had made himself at home in my space in a way that felt both presumptuous and completely natural. I did not move the chapstick. I left it there next to my things, a small declaration of shared territory. Over the following weeks, other signs of his presence began to accumulate in my apartment. A coffee mug in my sink that was not one of mine. A book he had been reading left open on my kitchen table. A sweater draped over the back of my couch like it belonged there. None of it felt intrusive. If anything, it felt like my space was finally being lived in the way it was meant to be. Ivy started appearing more often too, usually on Sunday mornings when Caleb would bring her over for what he called our lazy day routine. She would curl up on my living room rug with one of my books, sounding out words while Caleb made breakfast in my kitchen and I read the newspaper at the table. These mornings felt like something borrowed from a life I had never quite imagined for myself. Domestic in a way that should have made me nervous, but instead filled me with a quiet contentment I had not known I was capable of. On one particular Sunday in late May, I woke to the sound of voices in my kitchen and the smell of something delicious cooking on my stove. I found Ivy sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in drawing another elaborate map of an imaginary place, and Caleb standing barefoot at my counter, scrambling eggs in a pan. The sight of him there, moving through my space with such easy familiarity, made something warm unfurl in my chest. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, his hair sticking up in the back, where he had slept on it wrong, and he looked more at home in my kitchen than I sometimes felt. "Good morning," he said when he noticed me in the doorway, and his smile was soft and unguarded in the way it only was during these quiet Sunday moments. "Good morning," I replied, and meant it more than I had ever meant those words before. This was not a relationship in any way that would make sense to outside observers. We had not had conversations about exclusivity or the future. We had not made plans beyond the next week or discussed what any of this meant for his daughter or his divorce or the careful life he was still rebuilding. But it was something real and present and growing in the spaces between what we said and what we did not need to say. Later that morning, after breakfast, and after Ivy had finished her map and shown us the elaborate legend she had created for all the imaginary cities, I excused myself to brush my teeth and get properly dressed for the day. In the bathroom, I reached automatically for my toothbrush and caught sight of that black tube of chapstick that had been living on my counter for weeks now. On impulse, I picked it up and drew it slowly across my bottom lip, then my top, the way I had watched Caleb do countless times. It tasted like mint and possibility. I walked back to the kitchen, where Caleb was loading dishes into my dishwasher and Ivy was organizing her colored pencils with the serious concentration she brought to all her creative endeavors. "Want it back?" I called to him, echoing the words that had started all of this months ago in my basement. He turned from the sink, and when he saw my expression, his face lit up with understanding and something that looked very much like joy. He crossed the small space between us and cupped my face in his damp hands, studying my mouth with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then he leaned in and kissed me softly, tasting the mint chapstick and whatever this new thing between us was becoming. When we broke apart, Ivy was watching us with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she had shown when she drew her picture of us holding hands. She did not seem surprised or confused, just pleased that the adults in her world had finally figured out what she had understood all along. The afternoon stretched ahead of us, full of ordinary possibilities. We would probably take a walk to the park, maybe stop for ice cream. Caleb would drive Ivy back to her mother's house later, and then return to my apartment for dinner and whatever quiet evening we would make together. None of it was extraordinary. All of it felt like the beginning of something I had been waiting my whole life to find. Outside my kitchen window, the maple tree was full of new leaves, and birds I had not heard all winter were singing in its branches. Spring had finally arrived, bringing with it the promise that things could change, that winter always ended, that sometimes the best parts of life began when you stopped looking for them and simply let them find you. In the soft light of that Sunday morning, surrounded by the gentle chaos of breakfast dishes and colored pencils and the easy presence of two people who had somehow become essential to my happiness, I finally understood what home was supposed to feel like.